Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Robin, and I am part of the Conflict Dynamics team. Firstly, a warm welcome to our webinar on cultural considerations when mediating. A big thank you for joining us. As we all know, September marked Heritage Month in South Africa, a time in which we are encouraged to embrace what we inherited from our ancestors, but also a time to celebrate our history and our cultural roots and to foster a shared identity. As the African proverb states, umuntu gumuntu gabantu, which translates to a person is a person because of people. This Zulu phrase crosses language and cultural borders and affirms our humanity and captures our essence of respect and unity amongst all cultures. In our webinar today, Felicity Steadman will be joined by Nomonde Keswa, Lazarus Phetla, James Mangerere, and Hendrik Kotze, who are going to unpack how to manage cultural considerations when mediating. Because as mediators, we are cultural bridges, and it's important for us to be culturally aware, to be culturally sensitive, and culturally accepting of other cultural identities, whilst not undermining our roles as neutral third parties. Before I hand over to our speakers, I invite everyone to please join us in the conversation by using the Q&A. We'd love to hear your inputs in the conversation too. And lastly, enjoy the discussion. Felicity, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Robin. I want to make first of all, welcome everybody and introduce myself. I think I know most people who are coming in as participants, but if I don't know you, I am a director in conflict dynamics. I'm a mediator, originally an employment mediator, but more recently commercial mediator, and I do a wide range of cases. From a cultural point of view, I work in South Africa, and I would describe myself as South African, in fact, 11th generation South African, but I'm actually beaming to you from the UK. So I have a different cultural orientation when I am in the UK, perhaps. A couple of points on Zoom. It would be helpful if people kept themselves on mute. I think, in fact, that is the default. But amongst our panelists, perhaps mute unless you want to make a point. And we are hoping to record. In fact, Robin's turned on the recording. Robin's made the point about Q&A and chat as well. Feel free to put any points in there. And we will, as participants, answer the Q&A if we notice something that resonates with us and we feel we have something to contribute. I'm going to ask each of my co-panelists to introduce themselves by name, say where they're located geographically, because of that, of course, that influences one's cultural orientation. And then briefly, as I did, something about the type of mediation that they do, because I think there's probably points we're going to make about how there are also different cultures in different types of mediation. So let me start, Lazarus, with you.
Thank you, Felicity, and greetings to everybody. It is an honor and a privilege to be part of this webinar. And I would like to take this opportunity to say I'm Lazarus Phetla, the director of SAITA, the acronym of South African Institute of Traditional Authority. I am based in South Africa, and most of my work is in community. Basically, we work with traditional leaders, House of Traditional Leaders, Traditional Affairs Department, and I also do a lot of mediation, community-based mediation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lazarus. Nomonde.
Good morning, everyone. I am Nomonde Keswa. I am a director at Conflict Dynamics. I'm also a mediator. I am based in KwaZulu-Natal in a small town called Umzimkhulu. I work mainly on workplace mediation and family community mediations. That's basically where I do most of my work. A little bit of commercial, but that's very, very little.
Thank you, Nomonde. James?
Yes, good morning. Yes, good afternoon in Kenya. So I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. My name is James Mangerere. I'm the President Mediation Training Institute, East Africa, and also a distinguished fellow of the International Academy of Mediators. I train mediators in East Africa and all the way to Zambia and up all the way to West Africa. So I train all around. And I specialize in community, commercial, and workplace mediation, though I also do family mediation most of the time. Thank you very much for welcoming me to this webinar.
Thank you, James. And Hendrik.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join all of you this morning. I practice as a mediator. I'm physically based in the Eastern Cape, but my work takes me physically all over South Africa, and a lot of my work is also online internationally. I tend to do a lot of work in commercial mediation, but also in conflict within organizations. And interestingly enough, some of the international work within organizations is also within organizations that have a broad cultural reach. In some cases, some of the organizations I've worked with have participants in 15 or 16 different countries and from a range of different cultures.
Thank you, Hendrik. Right, well, it's a big topic we're tackling, and it comes on the, as Robin was saying, on the crest of the wave, really, of our work over the last month or so on heritage and Heritage Month. So we've done quite a bit already. You'll see a newsletter, or rather an article that appeared in our newsletter on our website under the resources section, written by John Brand, Robin, and myself about our mediation culture in South Africa. You'll also see a podcast between myself and Milton Bennett, who's an intercultural specialist, talking about intercultural sensitivity. And we had an interesting mediator professional development session last week with Milton, talking with us about the value of working on our intercultural sensitivity. I had a look for some definitions, and Hofstede, the social psychologist, well known for pioneering research on cross-cultural groups and organization, says about culture that it's the software of the mind. It's the programming of the human mind by which one group of people distinguishes itself from another. So we've already heard distinguishing ourselves by location, sector of work, language, perhaps race, other dimensions. Deal and Kennedy, who described company culture and did a lot of work on organizational culture in the 1980s, have a lovely definition, which is culture is basically the way we do things around here. So as a mediator, we might be thinking about how do they do things around here, and how can I fit in to be effective? So we wanted to start by just putting up two polls to ask you two questions about how much you might be thinking about culture in your work. So Robin, if you could put up the first poll. So how much have you thought about whether your cultural orientation might impact your mediation style? So people's responses are streaming in. I think I can honestly say that for many years, I didn't think about culture. And perhaps I was in Milton Bennett's place of denial on his spectrum of cultural orientations. because I just thought everyone else's culture was pretty much the same as mine. And I wasn't thinking what the differences might be and what I might be bringing to the mediation that might be, exacerbating conversations, because I was making assumptions about what was the right way to look at things. Okay, let's look at the results. So really good to see that people are thinking about it a lot. And fewer people are thinking about it less. Although if you add a little and not at all, it's slightly more than a lot. So I think there is still quite a bit of work to do. Oh no, that's not quite true. 4 versus 5, yeah. Okay, so there's still work to do. Let's look at the second poll. So to what extent do you factor cultural orientations of the parties into your mediation practice? So when you're going to a mediation, is it a question you might ask in your preparation conversations with the parties? You know, a simple question like, how do you do things around here? What is your attitude to decision-making in this organization or in this community? Who has sign-off on this deal? Is it an individual or is it the community? What about who sits at the table? Is there a cultural consideration there? Is it everybody, or is it only the appointed leaders? Do they have to speak back to go back to their constituency before signing off? Okay, so somewhat, let's have a look at the results. Somewhat more than, so this is more than in the previous poll, asking questions of the parties before and during about their cultural orientation. Okay, thank you, Robin, for that. I just wonder if any of my colleagues want to comment on those responses. You're okay. Okay, all right, well, let me explain the format of the session. We've identified five or six questions that we want to tackle, and they raise they're around 5 or 6 dimensions of culture in dispute resolution that we thought we might all have something to say about. And so I'm going to ask of the panelists the question and ask one particular person, and then pick up comments from others. And we may give examples, we may give suggestions about how we have dealt with things that worked out well. And then at the close of the webinar, we want to ask, how do we determine those cultural nuances? And how do we hone our intercultural sensitivity so that we do work more consciously with culture? So I'm going to start off with our first question, and Lazarus, I'm going to turn to you on this. And this was a point we discussed yesterday when we were preparing, and it was about, what is the goal? What do the parties understand the goal of mediation to be? Do they understand it to be a win-win, a win-lose? Is it a transformative, restorative process? Is it about relationships, or is it contract focused? And of course, it'll differ per sector, commercial mediation versus community mediation, but there might be other considerations there. So Lazarus, your thoughts first.
Thank you, Felicity, and greetings once again to all the participants and my colleagues, and Felicity also for such an informative introduction. I thought that it was very ice-breaking. One could already hear that some of the things that we have in mind, you have already touched on them briefly. But to just shift the gear Let me start by saying, in Africa in general, or South Africa in particular, there has been a long traditional ways of negotiating conflicts and resolving disputes. And as you would know, pre and post 1994, a lot of negotiations were being done there. And it was through mediation that today South Africa has the freedom that it has, and all of us, we are enjoying. And so this traditional way of, and the reason why I'm saying traditional, it is because there is a particular concept that all of us, we carry as Africans and South Africans, and that is the spirit of Ubuntu. So, so this traditional way, it consists of the spirit of Ubuntu, and mainly it applies in conflicts where you've got your decision makers in organizations, in tribal lands, in families, and in community leaders. So, but to answer your question more directly, I would say in an African context, if if the goal basically of cultural mediation, it's basically to understand the local context of the people and the community. And that goes to the history of the people, it goes to the culture and the values of the people. So while you are in mediation, mediating this whatever dispute that is before you, but that also has to do with an understanding of the history, the culture, and the values of that particular community. And of course, Felicity, there are different ways in which this mediation, it's cultural mediation, it's being facilitated. And that goes to, one can look at the headman of the clan. One could also look at the tribal chief. One could also look at the neighbors. So while we are speaking of the goals, one has to also look at who is in charge of the actual mediation. And speaking of who is in charge, which I've mentioned the headmen, the tribal chiefs, and even the elders in the neighbors, that will also speak to the question of, is mediation being done to restore relationships? Yes, I would say yes. Mediation in a cultural context, it is about a restoration of relationships. It is about a contract agreement, and that basically, when contract, we look at it from even the lobola space in an African context, an agreement between the two families. And sometimes it is done for the purposes of restorative justice. And that will basically go to the crimes which have been done to the other family. So just to put my submissions into context, I would say the goal of cultural mediation, it's basically has to do with restorative justice. It has to do with contract. It has to do with evaluation of whatever matter which the community might be faced with. It could be the development, it could be the mine that affects them. So it is done for those purposes. And the goal, basically, it will be about that. And one will obviously have to look at the history, the culture, and the values. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Hendrik. I know you had a point on this in relation to organizations, perhaps, companies and organizations.
Yes, Felicity. As I said, I often work within organizations where over time conflict has developed and has almost become embedded in the way that people are interacting with each other, and within the organization there's polarizations, there's divisions, and people have fallen in that way of engaging it and then are almost unable to disengage from that. And I think when we as a facilitator start working in an environment like that, kind of the first thing that the people are actually looking to achieve is almost a sense of empowerment to be able to speak about what they've experienced and the situation that they find themselves in. Very often there are a substantial number of people or even groups of stakeholders that are marginalized in an organization that experiences this kind of conflict, and for them the process of facilitation really becomes an opportunity where their voice can be heard and where they can actively start participating in a conversation that could potentially change the dynamics within the organization. So in that sense, just that feeling of empowerment is already almost a major goal of the whole mediation process in that kind of environment. Specific outcomes start following when marginalized people and people who feel they haven't had a voice find a seat at the table, and where you can start having constructive conversations about the issues, that then specific outcomes follow. But almost the main aim that you're achieving for is that ability for people to have more or less equal power in the conversations that need to be had.
Yes, and I think as mediators we're well, I find it fascinating because you move from one organization to the other and you do get a tangible sense of a different culture. In some there's a culture of fear, in some there's a culture of brazenness, yeah, so it can differ. Now, James, before I go on to the second question, you actually work in a number of different countries in Africa, and I just wondered if the goal of mediation, you find the goal of mediation or the sort of win-lose, win-win mindset differs from country to country. And then let's go on to the second question.
I think the context of mediation in our African culture, which transcends the religions that we just talked about, is that we are a social context. The purpose of mediation is both facilitative and transformative. Facilitative in the sense that we need a third party that we can trust to help us resolve our disputes because we are capable of doing it ourselves. Transformative for the purpose of ensuring that we can restore relationships, because in our African context, relationship is very important. We are social animals, that is our culture. Because when people are hurt, they are in conflict, the intention of mediation is to soothe their feelings and restore what we call social harmony. Therefore, if you look at across the region, that is in East Africa, Central, and even in West Africa, you realize that is what we call some kind of homogeneity. We tend to have some similar cultural dispensations because we believe that when conflicts occur, they affect the whole family, they affect the whole society. Therefore, our intention is to resolve conflicts, to restore societal harmony. If you look at that, that is the purpose. So it's equally facilitative and transformative at the same time.
And that resonates very much with what Lazarus, you said. So James, you've talked about social context, and Lazarus, you talked about understanding the local context, the social context, and thinking about the context that you're going into, and also goals being perhaps not so much about achieving an outcome, but about soothing relationships and restoring relationships. James, on our second question, which is about how a relationship, how agreements are built, and what the culture around building the agreement is in a mediation process. We've already heard mention of headmen, tribal chiefs, neighbors, elders. In your experience, in your mediations, is it a kind of top down or bottom up? Are you building consensus from the bottom, or does it come from the top and is it imposed? What is the cultural nuance there we need to be thinking about?
Well, I think I just talk out of experience. There's a time when I had a contract with the European Union to train community elders in Africa, different parts of Africa, on how to resolve conflicts. And in the time of training, I would listen to them first of all. They talked about mediation. So I would ask them a question and try to ask them to illustrate how they used to do mediation. And I was surprised. If you look at the kind of mediation we have in the African continent, and mostly in East Africa, Central and West Africa, you realize that elders made decisions at the end of the day. They listened to the parties, and because elders were trusted, they were allowed to make decisions on behalf of the disputants. And if you look at it, it was not pure mediation. In fact, it's something that we can describe as quasi-arbitration, because an arbitrator comes in to make a decision on behalf of the parties. So every time I told them to demonstrate how they used to handle mediation in the traditional setup, they used to tell me that parties gathered under a tree, they presented their cases, and the elders had to deliberate on those cases, and the people to make decisions were elders. And not only elders, in fact, it involved chiefs, priests, traditional priests, and sometimes they could even go to what we call secret cults. A secret cult was a group of people who are respected and feared at the same time, who would sit down and then make a decision on behalf of the parties. So as I was trying to train them on mediation being an empower parties to make decisions, they told me it was something a little bit different, because the elders being trusted, regarded as people with wisdom, were respected, and therefore their decisions held the day at the end of the time. But now the problem was that since these elders were respected, there are instances when you'll find that one of the disputants was a woman or a lady. And these people were not allowed to face the elders face to face. And therefore, it was difficult for a person who was of that gender to stand in front of those elders and present their cases. And they had to do it through a third party. And therefore, I thought that was an impediment to the resolution of dispute using our traditional type of mediation, which was purely quasi-arbitration. But we respected our elders. We do it even now. And it's across cultures. We believe they have wisdom, and that the decisions they make are for the welfare of ensuring that there's community harmony. That's how we looked at things from that perspective. Yeah.
Fascinating. And I want to turn to Nomonde here, because the kinds of thoughts that are going through my mind here are questions around patriarchy, the place of women at the table, and the degree to which they participate in crafting the outcome. Nomonde, your thoughts?
As James was explaining how elders are trusted, that they have this wisdom, that the decision they make will be readily acceptable. I find, though, that in some societies, the standing of women in relation to men when there is a dispute, you find that there's difficulty for women to sit across the table and speak out. I pick this up mostly when I do pre-mediation meetings, where the women will tell you what they want to tell you, how the dispute developed in their perspective, from their perspective, but they will tell you outright, I will not sit at the table and have a discussion with so-and-so because so-and-so is my elder. I from a position from my position as a woman in the family, I cannot talk with the or have a direct conversation, as direct as I am able to do so with you as a mediator. So you find that even though as a mediator, you are there to try to level the playing field, but you find it is very, very difficult to have a joint meeting. As a result, I tend to use side meetings a lot and do the go-between, conveying messages and whatever is that I feel, and within the context of confidentiality, of course. But I find that women find it very, very difficult to sit in, and it also happens in where a man has a number of wives. You find that there is a wife who feels, say the last wife is the one who feels completely disempowered. The young wives would expect the elder wife to be the one who can put across their issues as women in the relationship. But obviously their experiences in this relationship are not the same. So there's a lot of disempowerment in those societies based on the patriarchal system, if you wish, in those cultural considerations.
And it's interesting how you've talked about finding a process solution to managing that the awkwardness experienced on the part of the women, so keeping parties in separate side meetings. I want to just call upon Robin, who is our mediation process administrator, and just ask you in relation to appointing women as mediators. Do you find that there are cultural nuances there? How do you manage that?
Well, absolutely, Felicity. Well, just as a starting point, I think that as someone that case manages, a variation of mediations, when I get clients that call and will inquire or find out, I think as a young Black woman, I'm definitely subjected to the intersection of gender, race, and age. For example, if a client has called and they'll speak to me, they'll ask, oh, can I speak to someone a bit more senior? Another example would be, oh, thank goodness I got through to you. You would understand from a cultural point of view my dispute. Those are just examples in the workplace, which also just is an indication of how socialization plays out in the workplace, and also how men and women's status is reflected in workplace structures and cultures. But another example in terms of appointing women, I think if a client comes and we give options, some would overtly say, we prefer men, we want someone a bit more dominant and a bit more assertive. We don't think a woman will be capable to, handle a dispute like this. So just to highlight that, like I said, socialization definitely plays out, whether it's, in the workplace or at home.
Right. James or Hendrik or Lazarus, any comment on this? Hendrik?
Felicity. Lazarus, you want to go first?
Thanks, Hendrik. Yes, so Felicity, I was listening to Nomonde, and she raised something very, I think it will add value to our discussion, which has to do with polygamous marriage. In the first place, So that it also goes to the issue of, or the question of patriarchy. And to say, you see, in a tribal or royal rather, a context, you will find that there is a first wife, which the king or the chief chooses. And then there's a second wife, again, the leader, the traditional leader chooses for himself. Then maybe there's a third one. But there is also what we call a royal wife. Now, with the royal wife, now that wife, her function is basic, and this is it's what we see today in the Zulu monarch, that and the conflict that it's happening now, where you find that there is a wife who is married particularly for the royal family. So it is not the king who marries the wife, you know, on his own, how can I put it, his own will, but he does it for the royal family and the Zulu community. And this wife, as much as she is there to bring or to give birth to the next king or chief, you'll find that this wife does not have the powers, you know, in the running and the decision and the mediation of where the family needs to go. But actually it goes to the first wife, which the decision of whatever that discussions that the decision needs to be made, the first wife is the one who's got the powers. And so the point that I'm trying to raise here is that also when we speak of women and the patriarchy in that area, is that firstly, in a traditional context, we look at the hierarchy of the same women. So there are certain women who will have the powers to be part of the negotiations, of the discussions, depending on their position within that hierarchy. And of course, there are, as I've given here the example, the second wife, the third wife, and the royal wife will not necessarily have such powers. And we see it, I mean, even in my personal experience, is that whenever there is a lobola negotiation, you'll find that there is an aunt from the husband, there's an aunt from the wife. So my aunt from that does not have necessarily the powers, you know, to get into the negotiation room for the lobola. But whereas my wife's aunt, they call it Rakhadi for those who understand the indigenous languages, Rakhadi. She's the one who actually has the power. So for as much as women, and you would have seen that now there has been, the government has tried some development that is Hendrik, you will relate to this, the Traditional Leadership Framework Act, where they sort of try to bring women into the traditional councils, and so that they become part and parcels of the decision making. But that it only works basically according to the research that we have done in your urban, so-called urban traditional communities or royal families. But if you go deep into the rural villages, it goes to what Nomonde was saying, to say women are still, you know, not being considered and not included in whatever discussions or mediations that needs to be made. But this is very sad, because women, at the end of the day, they are the ones who run their household. They are the ones who understand the children and even the issues that are happening within the family and the community. And I think the traditional community at times, they are missing that opportunity to involve and to include women, because really, as much as the laws can be made, but it goes back to the issue of saying, are the communities ready to transform? Are the people ready to accept change? And you know, unfortunately, when it comes to customs and culture, you'll find that people strongly hold the values, you know, of their traditions and of their cultures. So to come and say a woman has an input, the law says this, then you might have some challenge. But I thought maybe I just bring that into the discussion. Thank you so much, colleagues.
And Lazarus, I know you do a lot of work in company community conflict, particularly in the mining industry, where mines are in negotiation with communities over the exploitation of resources and the use of land. And so while some of these issues might, one might think, oh, well, I don't do community mediation, so this is interesting, but it's not in my purview. But actually, it must come straight into a commercial negotiation of the use of resources in a company community ESG sort of dispute.
Absolutely. It does have a link. You see, in mediations that I do between the conflicts that arise between the traditional communities and the mining companies, you'll find that the issue of, as a mediator, one needs to also consider the power dynamics that come out of that environment. And I mean, when I say power dynamics, it will basically touches on the issue of finances, political influence, and also even the hierarchy of the traditional leader that is within that community. So yes, they do have a link, and I think it's also important to mention that mediators need to also consider, as they are commercial mediators, but you also need to consider the power dynamic, or let me rather say, instead of power, say social dynamics, which operates within that specific community, because there's so many things that happen, but it's just that I cannot at this stage go, and indicate to the panel what are those issues. But as a mediator, to summarize, it is very important for one to consider the social dynamics that are within that community.
Yeah. So back to James's social context point. Hendrik, we were going to come to you on this point about gender, but I wonder if you couldn't also pick up on one of the questions that's coming through in the Q&A about values, and Lazarus mentioned the word values as well. So start with gender and then comment around values.
Well, if I could start with values, if that's okay, Felicity. I think listening to Lazarus and James and Nomonde, and specifically about the kind of the role that mediation has played traditionally in communities where there is a tradition of the community coming together and having conversations about difficult things and finding resolutions. There's such a deep learning in there about how to solve problems in the sense that problems can be solved if people share common values that kind of give the parameters about what is an acceptable solution and what isn't. And secondly, if people have a commonly understood way of how to have difficult conversations. And often when I work within organizations where there is embedded conflict, the conflict is actually a values conflict or a cultural conflict, because people see the world so differently that everything that they interact with people who see it in a different way becomes an issue, not because the specific thing is an issue, but because at the deep-seated almost level of identity, they feel affronted by how the other perceive the world and perceive the specific problem. So one has to try and find a way of bridging that gap when you work in that kind of environment. And what I've done in the past, and what does seem to work, is to have a first conversation with the group to get them to agree a set of common values that aligns with their personal values, but that they as a group can expressly agree to as being the values that they as a group can agree to. And that then becomes a point of reference against which they can test different outcomes and different options about problems that they have to solve. And it's wonderful how once that specific agreement is there about what values we as a group embrace, how in the language and in the conversations about problems, people more and more start referring back to that, and that creates a common ground for them to find workable solutions. And the second conversation that we have in environment like that is a conversation about how do we have difficult conversations. So both of those then create the space where people are much more able to actually deal with the specifics of issues that are in front of them.
James and Nomonde, any comments on the points that have been made? Nomonde?
Yeah, I would say in an organization, the issue that Hendrik touched on, maybe in his earlier presentation, around the culture that in an organization is pervasive. Is it an organization that allows different opinions, or is it an organization where the boss is always right? It doesn't matter whether the rest don't agree with. If the boss has decided that this is how things are going to go here, and then that's how things are going to be. And I've also observed when I have, as I say, in pre-mediation meetings, you find people that I will say this to you, but I cannot say it in a bigger group, lest they gang up against me. You sometimes find those types of fears, if you wish. Yeah. Based on the underlying culture. Yeah.
It relates to a couple of points that have been made in the questions. Paul Pretorius's first point in relation to being held to account for decisions around work that is done. So, and quite often in mediations, people are anxious about signing off, and the signing off process becomes very, very important because of exactly that. How accountable am I going to be? Am I going to be the one who's going to take the blame and be hung out to dry? And then there's a question here about how cultural dynamics influence decision-making in organizations, young versus old, new versus more established. So, James, I wondered if you had any points on decision-making and cultural considerations.
Well, I look at it from the context of how we deal with workplace conflict over here. I have realized that when we do deal with workplace mediation, mostly, culture really has got a serious impact. Because organizations where the boss makes decisions and everybody else is just a spectator, I found those organizations to be seriously ineffective. And these are the people who agitate to join the unions, because they tend to get their voice from the unions because they feel oppressed, they feel used, they feel that they do not have a chance to contribute in the organizations. Now, and that's why most of them resort to go to the Employment and Labor Relations Court. And this is what we are really discouraging. We are encouraging people to resolve their own conflict without resorting to the courts. But the issue is the culture of that organization. If you find that mostly we do not have an environment where people have some level of democracy, where they can raise their issues. If conflicts arise, there's a mechanism of dealing with them internally. You find that people always look outside for help. And the moment you realize that people have started looking outside for help, then there's trouble in those organizations. We always encourage what we call internal systems of resolving conflicts. There's what we call executive mediation, where we call it strategic management of organizational conflicts, where we adopt a culture of mediation rather than resorting to arbitration and litigation. And organizations that have adopted this type of resolution of disputes internally using mediation, you find that usually they have competitive advantage, because issues like loss of employees, issues like most of the diseases that we have, usually we say they are psychogenic in nature, they are caused by stress. And if you look at issues to do with stress, they are caused by ignored or mismanaged conflict. So the culture at the workplace usually may affect the way, the efficiency and the performance and productivity of the employees that you have. So organizations that have adopted a culture of resolving conflicts internally through the use of mediation have a competitive advantage over those organizations that use the archaic systems of the fiat, you know, the power of fiat. That's the problem that most organizations have. But organizations that have adopted this culture of internal resolution of conflicts, taking into account the views of all the parties involved, usually are ahead of the rest. But they also, now let me just touch about our African culture, how it's affecting organizations. You know, in our colonial period, we always believed that the boss, what the boss says is everything. You cannot question the orders given by the boss. And we have realized that even Africans who take over from the colonialists also adopted that system of being the boss, and the boss usually always is right. And this has affected the way people handle disputes. If you cross over a little bit to Uganda, and I think we discussed about that when we had this, whatever, you realize that women in the workplace, when you approach a man, the man's office for permission, either you want to go home or you want some sick leave or some kind of, you don't have, you first of all, they have the culture of kneeling down. You must kneel down to the ground before you address your boss. And this has been adopted from I think the traditional culture that your boss is, especially if they are male, they are superior, and therefore they can only be addressed while somebody is kneeling down. And those are some of the cultures that are abhorrent the way people operate these days, and they affect the productivity and the morale of employees at the workplace. Things I think that we are slowly moving over. That's as much as I can comment right now.
Quite often when we talk about culture, we refer to things like body language, eye contact, personal space, those sorts of things. We often see those as manifestations of difference and particularly cultural differences. And so let's just talk about that whole question of parties' different senses, or different cultures having different senses of body language, physical space, personal boundaries, greetings, shaking hands, and how we might experience it differently. For me, one of the sort of searing experiences I remember as a young woman mediator in South Africa was the whole process of shaking hands and learning very quickly how to shake hands with white management, how to shake hands with black shop stewards and union officials in a way that made a connection, and being easy with that, you know, really getting into that. And then of course, eye contact and being conscious of whether that was appropriate or not. And I think I've come to the conclusion that largely one has to take one's lead from the people in front of you. And you can't make assumptions that every shop steward wants to shake hands in a particular way, or that every older person doesn't want to look at you directly in the eyes. But let's hear from our panelists, perhaps starting with Nomonde on this question of body language and personal space, etc.
Yes, I find that body language does influence to some extent, especially at the beginning of the mediation, where you're trying to create that rapport with all the parties at the table. So I personally become sensitive to what it is that I can do, such that I am not read as perhaps I am more favorable towards party A and not party B. As an example, when I first meet with the parties, I am conscious of how I shake the hands. And I make it a point that if I shake all the hands in the same way. But if you've got parties from different cultures, say you've got white and black opposition parties, white people will just shake the hand and that's it. But some black people will shake the hand, I don't know how to demonstrate it. They will shake the hand in this way, in that way, you know, different ways in the same shake. But if you start doing that with one party and not the other, it may be interpreted. This is where I am never sure, because I don't know what the cultural orientation of these people is. Mm. It might just be that the white people, I just had I don't want to say a casual, because it's not casual, but it's just a one handshake, as against the black one, which goes all directions. It might just be interpreted as I am being more friendly towards this party and not the other one. Mm-hmm. That's one. And the other one is about the eye contact. In mediation, we do emphasize, as part of relationship building, we do emphasize the maintenance of eye contact, that the eye contact is good. But in African culture, and as I was growing up as a young girl also, you couldn't look an elder person in the eye when you talk to them. That would be a show of disrespect. In fact, even now, even with my own children, if we have a discussion about something and the child looks at me and tells me something, I immediately feel like it's an affront, it's a confrontation. So I always keep that in mind, that the type of biases that I hold, particularly as they reflect on body language and how I interpret body language, I've got to keep that in mind, because it does influence how I see people and the things they say to me.
Mm. Last week in our Mediator Professional Development session, Milton Bennett made the point that half the children in the world at this moment are being told, don't look at me when I'm cross with you. And the other half are saying, look at me, take this seriously. So it does differ. Lazarus, you had some points on body language and personal space.
Thank you, Felicity. Let me start by saying, while cultural mediation has to do with peace building, has to do with relationship building, while it has to do also with reconciliation of the previous historical and traumatic situations that maybe that community might have experienced. A mediator in that environment has to know, and we have spoken about this, about the culture and the value of the community. So in other words, it is very, while on one hand, you must have a knowledge of the geographic knowledge, you must have a knowledge of social dynamics, you must have the ethnicity and knowledge and aspirations of that particular community. You also have to have the right body language. And if one were to speak, let me actually give you an example. This other time, I have built the rapport, I have done the geographical, I've gathered the geographical knowledge, I've understood the social dynamics, the ethnicity and the aspirations of that community. And what I do, they give me a call, and I was on holiday. I just told them I'll just drive by. So when I went there, I was wearing shorts. You see, so in me wearing shorts, when I entered the kraal, and that was an offense. So I had to pay the fine because of me wearing the short, disrespecting the royal family and disrespecting the elders and the headmen within that traditional family. The other example that I can give was also when I entered, this other time I entered, but I did not make the praises at the gate. Now I'm speaking from the African cultural context here. And I never made, you know, the praise like, Bayete. And then they go, Wena Wezulu. And then you identify yourself. Hey, I'm Lazarus Phetla. I'm born of this generation. Just because of you never did that, you know, that was in itself an offense, and you had to pay because it disrespect. This other time, we were in a meeting with other stakeholders. A woman crossed her legs, and the man never took that kindly. In fact, it broke the negotiation just because of one party who happened to be a white woman who crossed the legs. And for them, that was a disrespect. And so what I'm saying, to answer your question in relation to the body language, those are some of the things which a mediator in a cultural mediation, in an African cultural context, needs to always consider. So you need to look at your appearance. You need to understand also the clan praises, you know, and you also need to as Nomonde has already said, the shaking and how the eye contact. But there's one thing that I can also advise the mediators and the panel here is that make sure that whenever you go and visit the chief, you have a bottle of whiskey, brandy, and a pack of cigarettes. that it also opens doors for you. But yes, so just to summarize what I'm saying, it is very important for the mediators when they enter into a traditional community to mediate whatever issue that they might have with whoever, is that firstly, they need to understand the geographical knowledge, because you cannot speak, it's an offense. If you mention a certain area in a wrong way, that might also come as you being disrespectful and not taking into consideration, you know, their historical history in that, with that term of the, it might be the ancestral name which they name that place. Now, for you to call it wrong, that might be a disrespect to the ancestors and to the chief. So you need to know the geographical, you need to have a geographical knowledge of the area. You need to understand the social dynamics. You need to know the ethnicity and the aspirations of that community, and you bring that with the body language to balance your rapport and, you know, to present yourself in a right way. Thanks.
Yes, I am increasingly conscious in mediations and trainings that I do around the world, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US. Right up front, a comment is made or a prayer is given in relation to the ancestral land and who this land belonged to before it was colonized, and an acknowledgement of that before you can even start talking. So that, that relates to your point about the land and, the heritage. Now, Lazarus, I must ask you, some ethical bells were going off in my mind when you were talking about take a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of whiskey. And I see that Duncan has raised a point in the Q&A about when does the mediator simply, as he said, tap out of the mediation and say, I can't be part of this. Because what is about, your accommodation, one's accommodation in the situation starts bordering on a challenge to one's independence and integrity. So Hendrik, let me turn to you on the confidentiality question, because that is an area where there are different cultural orientations, and it can really challenge one's ethics as a mediator. Do I go along with this idea that there's no such thing as confidentiality, or how do I work with that?
Yeah, Felicity, I think confidentiality is in the way that we typically practice it in mediation and in shall I call it the Western context is very much an individualistic sense, where confidentiality attaches to the person, and that Western view also attaches kind of the primary set of rights to the individual, a very individualistic worldview, and so in that sense that's how we've ended up practicing confidentiality, where we set the ground rules as what the individual says in a private meeting is confidential and it won't be disclosed. I think we have to acknowledge that worldview is not the only worldview out there. There are many communities out there who, and possibly even the majority of communities out there in the world, who have a much more collectivist worldview, where the individual is not the centerpiece of attention, but the group or the collective is the higher order, if I can call it that. And in that sense, claiming individualistic confidentiality over and above the interests of the group may be seen as something that's offensive from the perspective of that worldview. And so that probably is something that we should actually be acutely aware of as mediators, and inquire when we go into situations where there are dynamics of and a collectivist approach. And I certainly think in the African context, where we mediate in more rural communities, Lazarus and Nomonde and James can perhaps also comment on that, but my sense certainly is that there is a much stronger collectivist sense still there, and claiming individual confidentiality over and above the view of what the community might feel is something that could be problematic. And so being curious about that and understanding how the group of people that you're working with view confidentiality is probably advisable, and then adapting how you use confidentiality in the process to what that group's understanding of and the value of confidentiality actually is.
Panelists, comments on that?
Yes, just to follow on Hendrik's footsteps, is that, for a mediator, again, or in a traditional community, let me put it so, it is very important also to observe the cultural differences of the people. And why I'm saying that is because if you speak of confidentiality in other cultures, there is no such thing as confidentiality. But other one in their cultural practice, there might be some. So it depends and on because remember in a cultural context, it is never individualistic. It is about the whole family. So let me give you an example, Felicity. If you allow me, I know you wouldn't take an offense with it's just an example. If your child throws a stone at my house and breaks my window, now the dispute, the conflict, it's not about the children or me and you personally, but it's about your family as a clan and my family as a clan. So when you speak of confidentiality in that context, it is also very important for a mediator to familiarize themselves to say, that is why I said you need to do your research. You need to go and understand the ethnicity of that and the heritage of whatever that you are dealing with in traditional communities, and understand that when you say confidentiality, then it will not be me and Felicity, but it will be my family, my wife, my children, and the grannies and the uncle, and the other side of them. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Yeah. James or Nomonde on this point? James, you're on mute.
I just wanted to go back a little and talk about body language before I talk about confidentiality. Now, body language in some communities, especially in East Africa, looking at the elders right at the eye is a sign of disrespect. So if you are addressing elders, you must look away from them. Well, it's so different from what we are taught in mediation. Number two, on the issues of body language, the way we welcome you into a mediation session is different. If you go to the northern part of Kenya, if you are going to resolve a dispute, a community dispute, the way they welcome you is a lady who takes a cup, milks a goat directly from the herder, and gives you the milk. As a mediator, you have to take that milk with a straight face. Otherwise, if you take the milk with a twisted face, indicating it is not boiled, the cup is dirty, you have rejected. So you have to go there knowing that this is what you want to be exposed to. Greeting also is different here, because some people you cannot greet them by hand. You can only clap your hands like that as a form of greeting. So sometimes you restrict your hand and nobody will get it. They will be surprised that you are stretching your hand towards somebody who doesn't greet anybody. Because some communities, they are pure. So if you touch their hands, you're trying to infect them with some level of impurity, and they believe so. Well, when it comes to confidentiality, issues about confidentiality are modern, because when conflicts happen, they affected the community, they affected the family, and therefore, if the conflict had to be resolved, the whole family was affected. In fact, even when people agreed, implementation of the agreement was a responsibility of the family. If it was not made, if they did not agree, then the whole family would face the consequences. So the element of confidentiality was unheard of. It's a new concept, because conflicts, this was public information, and they were just like a disease that needed to be treated, so that you can restore community harmony. That's what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nomonde, I see that you've indicated you will respond to the question about inheritance live. Is that something you can comment on now?
Yeah, I can comment on that. The question, I think, sorry about the name now, was what is the experience in other traditional settings? His experience that the elder son would inherit the land and de facto be the trust, the leader of that trust of that family. Yes, even in African traditions, traditional settings, it is like that if there is no will that's been, in fact, even if there's a will, you find that the family, the extended family, does not readily accept that there is a piece of paper that says something different from how it's done. Like the first child is the first son, not child, but the first son is the one, excuse me, is the one who inherits the land and therefore will be the one who kind of leads the family. It's like that, and it is a very difficult dispute to mediate. If, for instance, there are differences of how this elder son should be conducting himself in his role as the elder of the rest of the family. It can be a very, very difficult thing. And then for some reason in that dispute, even if it happens within one family, invariably the extended family comes in. So you don't just deal with this family, you deal with a whole lot of other people and other elders who have something to say about it.
And actually, I always assumed that this was a problem in rural communities, or not a problem, it was a way of doing things in rural communities. But as the questioner asks, it's something he or she's familiar with in Afrikaans communities, doesn't say rural or urban, but my sense is it's both. And if I think of English culture in the UK, it's only been very recently that people have moved away from the idea that the male is what's called a progenitor, that the male will inherit, the eldest male will inherit and will perpetuate the family heritage and get the house, the big house, and get all the furniture and the family portraits and that sort of thing. So this is not something particular to rural communities. Well, I want to now really move us to a conclusion, and we have a last poll, and then I'm going to turn to our participants for comments. And the last poll gives us a range of factors or aspects of mediation that might be affected by culture. Some of which we've talked about today, but we haven't managed to discuss them all. So if you could answer the poll and give us a sense of which of the following aspects of mediation would you say might be affected by culture? It's to really prompt us to think of things we need to think about. And as a multiple choice, then we might find that everybody says 100% on everything. So let's see what people say. Yeah, there's a whole question of bargaining. We haven't even touched on that. In labor management negotiations, the culture is very much a haggling culture. Whereas when we go into the commercial world and think about how much influence getting to yes and interest-based bargaining has had, haggling is much less, or haggling does happen, but it's people try to move away from haggling to an interest-based value enhancing type of process. So there's definitely a cultural difference in how people bargain. Dress code. We haven't even touched on dress code. Is it formal? Is it informal? Is it traditional? Is it office, business? Quite often when I train internationally for the International Labour Organization, people will come to the training in traditional dress. Definitely on the first day, maybe not every other day, but making a statement about their culture is really important. And the first time I did the training, I just arrived usual Western office wear. And, and I realized how boring that was, and how much more you can convey about where you're coming from by how you dress. But of course, one has to be careful about how that might impact a mediation. What messages does it send? So again, matching. All right, let's end that poll and have a look at the results. Yeah, communication style right up there, and 90% of people. And what we had in mind with communication style is, if you think of the Thomas Kilmann grid and adversarial or competitive versus collaborative and accommodative, or cooperative versus more of a bargaining style. So different cultures will have different styles, and people sometimes generalize, I think quite unhealthily really, that if you're in a place like Japan or China, the style is very much more accommodating. So people will you need to be doing things that indicate accommodation and acceptance at the beginning. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so as we move towards this closure of this really interesting conversation, I wanted to refer to this person I've mentioned a few times, Milton Bennett, and he has developed what's called the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, the DMIS, developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. And in this, he describes the developmental stages along which people can progress towards a deeper understanding and appreciation of cross-cultural differences. Beginning with denial, so the perception that one's cultural perspective is the only real, accurate, and valid interpretation of reality, and culminating on the other extreme with integration. And that's the internalization of multicultural awareness and the ability to interact productively across cultural differences. That sounds very much to me like the mediator. So my question in closing, two questions really to my panelists, is how do we determine what the cultural nuances are in each mediation? Because each one is like a little gem of a story and different. And how do we hone our intercultural sensitivity as mediators? Because it's a potential minefield where we could get a whole lot of things wrong. And in fact, one of the comments in the chat by Londiwe Senona is it's more about being culturally sensitive. It's actually more than just being culturally sensitive. It's truly connecting with the cultural effect and making an effort to understand and be aware of the applicable culture in the mediation process. So this is an onerous responsibility, we are told. So let me start and go in reverse order. And I think Hendrik, start with you and reverse order to how I started. And Hendrik, ask you, what can we do to sort of diagnose in the moment the cultural nuances, and how do we hone our intercultural sensitivity?
Felicity, I think my major awareness is that one doesn't always know what the appropriate thing is. One doesn't always know what is expected. And so for me, the guideline is basically in two things. The one is a sense of humility, respectful humility, if I can call it that, where one is open about the fact that you don't quite know what the right thing is, but indicating your willingness to respect whatever the right thing is, and then secondly, being curious about how people perceive the right thing to do. I have found invariably that if one approaches any situation with that approach, people feel invited to teach you how to what is appropriate and how they understand things, and at a very personal level, that I've had to do that. My wife is a Black South African woman, and I've had to integrate into her family and learn to understand how culturally things are done within that family context. And so at a very personal level, I've just found that if one approaches any situation with that respectful humility and that curiosity, it just opens the door and things go easy from there.
Thank you, Hendrik. James.
Well, it's all boils down to what we call cultural diversity and inclusion. Whenever you do a mediation, it's always important to understand, first of all, to find out what the culture of the people you're approaching is, because you can easily get embarrassed in the process. You know, sometimes we do these mediations mechanically, following the mediation process the way you were trained. But what I usually tell my students is that before you go into a mediation, it's important to hold what we call preliminary meetings with the parties. First of all, having a discussion for the parties to educate you about their culture and how sensitive, what is so sensitive in their culture. I mediated in Malawi one day, and I was surprised with the culture that I faced there. And I was in a hurry and I had to regret it. So every time I leave my station, before I carry out any mediation, the first thing is to interview the parties separately and try to understand their cultural context, what they like and what they don't like. How I should behave as a mediator so that I don't become an impediment in the mediation process, because you can be an obstacle yourself by coming into other people's culture and even striking some humor, which is offensive to the people you are talking to, thinking that you are entertaining them, and this you are really pricking them, and it can backfire. So it's important to understand first, before you go into any mediation, the cultural dispensation of the parties involved. Do your interviews in advance, do a preliminary meetings, and understand them well, so that by the time you are meeting, you're free to interact with them freely, knowing that you're not going to offend anybody in the process of mediation. That's what I can say.
Yeah, I love that point about don't be an impediment. Yep. Nomonde.
Yeah, I like my colleagues have just said, the pre-mediation meetings for me are for me to understand not only the dispute from the perspective of that particular person and to collect whatever information there is for me to go through, but also to understand how things happen here. What's the culture? What are the sensitivities that I must be aware of? And most of the time it does come up. In fact, almost all the time it does come up where people, for instance, will tell you about in this organization, you will find cliques. And in that particular clique, this is what is pervasive. So all those types of things, then you become aware also how to strategically convey information from one party to the other, in respecting all of what you have heard. So I find that and as Hendrik says, you do not know how things happen here, how things are done here. You don't know that. So the best way is to get the willing and curious to know how things are done there, such that you don't, as James said, you don't embarrass yourself or you don't become an impediment. I use the pre-mediation meetings to pick up on those issues.
Yes, yes. Lazarus.
Observation of cultural differences and comprehension of the problem. It's very important. Mediator, you must know and understand the challenges of the community. You must know the dynamics, and you have to be sensitive to the nature of the problem and be sensitive to the parties, to the people, to the communities themselves. Thank you.
And being open to learning. It's an ongoing learning process. I'm also really thinking a lot these days about my own culture. What is it that I stand for? Where do I come from? And can that be, how might that be an impediment or helpful in how I work? I want to just turn to Robin to give a final word of thanks to our panelists for a really fascinating conversation. Robin.
Thanks, Felicity. I think just to end off on my side, just to highlight that in essence, we are all products of culture. And I think that culture is the lens that we all see the world. And as mediators, it's important for us to be open-minded and to have a deeper understanding and appreciation of various cultures. So I think from my side, it's just being culturally humble and to keep that with you, whether in the workplace or in society. But just to end off, a big thank you to our speakers for joining us and to those who have streamed and joined us in today's conversation. We truly enjoyed it. Well, I enjoyed it, and just thank you for your inputs. It was just such a fruitful conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's end on that positive note. Thank you, Robin.